All right, yeah, let's begin. Anyway, people trickle in. They will. They can be fashionably late. Um, yeah, for the most part, I think the Grateful Dead went on more or less on time, I think. Um, at least at the beginning of the first set, give or take 15 minutes, at least in my era of Dead shows. Now, the second set, after the set break, all bets are off. It could you know, be a 40-minute set break. It could be a 90-minute set break. You never quite knew specifically, right? But nonetheless, so yeah, thanks everyone for coming, for hanging out on a Friday night. Really appreciate you being here. The Grateful Dead and Psychedelics. Boy, this is the fourth Fireside Chat that I've done. The others have been on like psychedelic churches and the yoga of psychedelics and various topics, that are kind of current intersections of the psychedelic movement and things that, I do spend a lot of my time in, and we'll be doing a lot more of these Fireside Chats. And honestly, it never really occurred to me to do one on the Grateful Dead and psychedelics. It's an intersection for me that hits, close to home. It's how I entered the psychedelic sphere of consciousness. Wasn't my family as much as everybody thinks it was the case. I mean, certainly my family introduced me to what psychedelics were. Growing up, I found out what LSD was, but the availability of it and actually consumption of it really had nothing to do with them. It had to do with my indoctrination into the dead scene, thanks to Bill Walton and John Perry Barlow, who were both really close with my family. And yeah, and that's sort of how I entered it. And so, it's an obvious intersection, right? And it's one that's kind of become almost like a pop culture cliche. I think most people who are aware of the Grateful Dead's legacy are also aware of the psychedelic influence in it. Um, but then, when Bobby died last month, um, that sent ripples throughout our community, right? One, I think it was kind of unexpected. Not kind of, it was unexpected. I mean, no question, Bobby was, especially in the last couple of years, was looking a lot older and a little bit more ragged and slowed down on stage. You could tell his playing slowed down considerably, but I certainly didn't know that he was terminal and that the end of his incarnation was near. And it was incredibly, incredibly sad. Not only because Bobby was such a incredible force of talent who really dedicated his life to playing music for us, I mean, we're talking like 5,500 shows, I mean, a life literally spent on stage, and that is such an incredible achievement. Um, but, the kind of the part of it that really, hit such a strong chord in me was that it was essentially kind of, the end of the Grateful Dead in the formal sense of what the Grateful Dead's at least institutional offering was. I mean, the Grateful Dead proper ended in 1995 with the death of Jerry, and everything afterwards was not the Grateful Dead, but the various incarnations and lineups definitely kept the scene going and kind of kept the train on the tracks in some way, shape, or form. Um, Yes, there are, as the statistic goes, there are 400 active Grateful Dead cover bands in America, which is an incredibly huge number, right? 400. But Bobby was definitely the glue to keep kind of official offerings going. And most recently with Dead and Company. And so with Bobby kind of checking out, that definitely sent some shockwaves, I think, through the scene. There will be Grateful Dead music being played in various iterations, but yeah, so it kind of closes the book on the official history of it. And Phil was just about, a little over a year before Bobby. Um, we do have the drummers around, but Billy is basically retired, and so we'll just kind of see what happens. All things must pass, and impermanence is it's a motherfucker. You got to make peace with it, like it or not. And that certainly was a moment to me where impermanence just hit me like a freight train. Um, you know, in my life and consciousness, I've always
What?
I'm going to mute you if you're too loud on the thing. Um, you know, um, yeah, in my consciousness, there was always kind of a show to go to, every year, since I was, 15 years old. I went to my first show at 14, but really started going when I was 15. Every year, there was a group of shows to go to, and there was always a plan to go to some shows and travel and get on the bus, the proverbial bus, and tune in and kind of see where the ride took us, Granted, it evolved a lot over the years, changed, Jerry was obviously such a force, but, the scene um, remained, that fabric of that subculture remained. And it was a really beautiful thing and such a huge part of my life. And I do feel a sense of loss and longing. Like, oh, well, what now? What am I going to go do now? Sure, there's lots of great live bands to see. I'm not saying there aren't, but that specific flavor of, the Grateful Dead and the various iterations, doesn't really exist. So, um, yeah, but it had me thinking, how could I talk about this stuff in a way that kind of felt authentic for what I do? I am a musician, pretty decent musician. I am, and pride myself on this and being encyclopedic on the Grateful Dead's history and their music. And I have incredible amount of knowledge on that. Avid, live show collector, and was the host on Guest the Year a couple times, and so I really have that part of it. But I didn't want to do just a fireside chat on just the music. I wanted it to be relevant to the world that I'm involved in. So, how can we explore the intersection of psychedelics and the Grateful Dead, besides just the cliche? You know, I think everybody is aware of that. Um, it's such a you know, it's kind of such a default of pop culture, kind of a default kind of perception of what the dead scene was, that people were just stripping off their face and dancing around, spinning around. But it really was so much more than that, and so much more profound than that, so much more nuanced than that, and also a lot more kind of literal than that. Um, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in the towards the end. But what I mean by that is how, the Grateful Dead scene, how it kind of fueled the marketplace for psychedelics, for the buying and selling, for better or for worse. This isn't here to pass judgment and say, oh, the Grateful Dead parking lot was just, a drug selling den, but it was a huge part of how LSD got disseminated out into the country. I mean, really kind of crazy statistics. Um, but from a more experiential perspective, I can say that it's kind of a weird thing to admit, but I don't remember my very first LSD trip. I can't exactly isolate the very first one, probably because I was so young. Um, so it kind of escapes me, you know. It probably had something to do with the Grateful Dead, but it maybe didn't. But I do remember one of like, it was probably one of the first three trips that I ever had. I was 15 years old. Um, that was at um, a Grateful Dead show, and on a pretty, significant dose of LSD. And I kind of started having a
Right. And you
synesthetic
want to think?
relationship.
Watching. Oh,
Eh,
yeah.
if you're, please mute if you're not muted. Thank you. Um, yeah, I had a pretty kind of synesthetic experience where I well, A, I was very close to the stage. Me and my friends, the way we went to the show, it was always about the music first and foremost. So we tried to get as close to the rail as possible. Um, and, the sound kind of started turning into this tangible thing that I could see. The music, started taking on physical characteristics of shapes and colors and almost like light waves. And the way the instruments were resonating in my body was giving me a tremendous kind of somatic response to it. And then kind of what morphed into it was kind of this aural, this audible kind of sensation to where my consciousness became a mixing board. I could isolate every member of the band individually. And for all of you who went to Dead shows, there were, six people on stage and two drummers, and there was kind of a lot of noise, and I could fade everyone in and out and hear just Bobby's guitar. I could hear just Mickey's drums and then just Bill's drums. I could hear just Phil, and I could mix it all back together again and play with like this mixing board in the sky kind of thing. And for a young, impressionable, fledgling psychonaut, this was such an amazing, amazing thing, And I remember looking around the audience and feeling this tremendous amount of kind of camaraderie and support of like, hey, how good the music was, and kind of the sense of safety, like, hey, are you okay? Are you okay? Are we okay? And just kind of really being in this pressure pot of sorcery and magic together, as this was kind of going on in my own consciousness, And I immediately, like, sure, I understood a little bit of the history of, the Grateful Dead and the acid tests and how LSD helped to kind of fuel the Grateful Dead sound. But, that was really intellectual knowledge. And it was like at that point did I really get it, you know? I really, really, really got it. Um, and I could understand from that point forward how the Grateful Dead's music was so synonymous with psychedelic inspiration and also so synonymous with kind of a safety blanket for exploring psychedelics on your own, Such a profound offering that they really gave psychonauts. The music had this inherent kind of pull to take you into it and then kind of spit you back out into yourself, It's kind of where the external informed the internal and so on and so forth. And it's such an incredible, incredible thing. Um, I mean, obviously, if you're here, you understand the Grateful Dead's music. But, if you even really listen to it today and analyze it, it's like, there are parts, especially in the jams, right, where each player is doing something so uniquely different that it's almost impossible to understand like how it all works together because it sounds so disjointed on the surface. But then when you listen to it holistically, it all works together. And like Phil's metaphor is that different fingers on one hand, you know? Um, and how that became a source of inspiration to embrace the psychedelic realm and the psychedelic experience and turn it into exploratory tool for my own growth and how I see the world. Back in those days, you know, I can't say that I really used psychedelics for healing as in the same way that we talk about them today. I really use them just as tools to, hey, go out to the outer atmospheres of consciousness and just, mining for truth and awareness and getting closer to God and discovering whatever God was. It really wasn't as focused and intentional of a healing modality as in the way that we look at it today. Um, and you know, and on that note, I do want before I do have some slides to share, by the way, and we are going to listen to some music too, because I think that's important. Um, these days in today's psychedelic culture, um, we talk so much about preparation, the journey, and then integration afterwards, and set and setting. While the term set and setting has been around for 60 years, Timothy and Ram Dass coined the phrase in the psychedelic experience. But the way that it's really adhered to today and the way that, such a huge part of the psychedelic community, and, there are people here from various psychedelic societies around the country, the events that are put on and the education that is disseminated is really centered around the safe and effective and intentional use of psychedelics. And there's almost a little bit of like, I'd say, especially with the rise of the medicalized model and the use of psychedelics to treat various afflictions, there's almost a little bit of distance now around what we call recreational use, and that term has become almost like you know, kind of like the redheaded stepchild, and like, we don't really talk about it as much as we used to, and it's almost like frowned upon in a way. But yet most people still do it in some way, shape, or form. Even the ones who are like really pushing the medicalized model and writing policy. This is a story I tell all the time, and this isn't a way to throw people under the bus or to call people out. But I was on a panel at a conference with some uh, people who were policy writers for specific states' psychedelic agenda. And I was getting into the whole cognitive liberty thread and recreational use, and they were really pushing back on me and like, no, this is really, for mental health and intentional use and you know, being supervised by guides and trained therapists, and we're not ready for that. Don't rock the boat, Zach, and all this. Then later on at the same night, you know, all those people are on the dance floor tripping on MDMA dancing, and it's not a way to call anyone out, but it's sort of like, hey, what weren't you just saying? So it's sort of like it's funny the relationship that we have these days with recreational use, as if, doing it at a dead show is somehow, not a sound protocol or something. Um, we could dissect that for ages. But on that note, I do have to be honest about it in that in my years going through Grateful Dead concerts, just as far as the numbers go, by the way, I went to about, I'd say, 115 Grateful Dead concerts with Jerry, about another 25 Jerry band shows, and probably about 300 post Jerry bands since. So saw Jerry quite a few times, and I did see people freak out. I did see people have a bad trip. I never did, amazingly, which is almost impossible to believe. But I never did. Somehow, and I think that's because I had a really good group of people around me, always. Really solid group of people around me who really, we looked after each other, and really made sure we were okay. Um, there were a couple times where, if I was on the rail or too close, there were too many people, maybe I had to bail and go to the hallway and find a quiet spot, but I never really went off the rails. But I definitely saw people go off the rails. Um, and yeah, that's something that, if you just look at the numbers and dictate the numbers, if you have, you know, I don't know what the numbers were, but say at the peak of the Grateful Dead's time, say there was a 25,000 person show. What's a sound number you think? Maybe 5,000 people were tripping out of 25,000, maybe. Sounds about a fair number, right? Certainly something's bound to go off the rails. And back then, there really wasn't support for that. Like we have the Zendo project today at Burning Man, for instance, or transformational festivals. And what Zendo does is fantastic. Wish they were around back then. Um, but, you know, what is it about the Grateful Dead experience that made psychedelics such an integral part of the fabric? What is it? Is it the music? Is it the culture? Is it both of them together? Is it kind of this collective hero's journey that everybody was on? And LSD, primarily LSD, was just part of the sacrament that indoctrinated you into the hero's journey? So I think it's all of this and more, right? Um, I'm going to just I did make this specifically, like I didn't want to, I do have some slides to share, but I didn't want this to be just like another keynote presentation. So I'm going to kind of blaze through the slides and there are plenty of nuances to talk about as we go along. Um, and then of course discussion at the end. Love to hear from you guys, but I do have some slides to share. So let me just do that. Um, and um, and I'm not going to make it full screen because it's incredibly clumsy Zoom with when I make it full screen. So um, I'll talk about that at the end, my psychedelic studies intensive. But we got to talk about the acid tests, right? The acid tests are such an important part of the question that I just put forth is what is it about the Grateful Dead that made it, you know, this perfect, almost utopianly ideal place to experience psychedelics? The acid tests, that was really the seed that was planted. The acid tests started in late 65, went into 66, and, Ken Kesey and the Magic Bus, was going around the country and setting up. This is a poster from one of the acid tests. Can you pass the acid test? Um, what happens here is likely to induce you. And with Allen Ginsberg, the Merry Pranksters, Neil Cassidy, the Grateful Dead. But the bus was going around various parts of America, and they find a cool little warehouse or little, sometimes art galleries, sometimes homes, and the price of admission was $1. And when you got in, you were given a cup of a mug full of LSD. And that was about all the screening there was. Talk about screening and preparation. There was none. You just showed up and got to take the acid. A couple months into it, Kesey and Cassidy and Ken Babbs realized, hey, we don't have any music. But this guy Jerry Garcia, and his friends, they've got this little band called the Warlocks, and maybe they can come along and add some music to the whole thing. So they did, and the Warlocks became the Grateful Dead. As you know, as the acid tests were going on, they morphed from the Warlocks into the Grateful Dead. So let's listen to just about 60 seconds of music from the acid tests with Jerry Garcia on guitar. Yeah, so not you know, that's only 60 seconds worth of music there. And for those of you who are Grateful Dead aficionados, that's I Am a King Bee, the song. Um, but barely. It's barely the song. Um, you know, um, Most of the time, the other members of the band, the members of the band were also on they were. On LSD. Um, no, let me do this. Um, And, Jerry Garcia said, there's a thing about playing stoned. If you have the space in your life where you can be high and play and not be in a critical situation, you can learn a lot of interesting things about yourself and your relation to the instrument and music. Phil Lesh said about the acid tests, it was dragon music, esoteric, asymmetrical music, unable to be conceptualized except by a few. Pretty, pretty cool quotes, right? But Jerry's quote, about you can learn a lot of interesting things about yourself in your relation to the instrument, your relationship to the instrument. And you can tell even in that 60 seconds worth of music, they weren't really good yet. They weren't, and that's okay. What we know of as the Grateful Dead wasn't really formed yet. It's pretty sloppy. It's almost atonal. Jerry's not the Jerry that we know yet. He's figuring it out. He's figuring it out in real time. Um, but that um, 9 months of acid tests, really helped to shape the sound and create the foundation for the Grateful Dead's music moving forward. That alchemical relationship with each band member, that viewing the Grateful Dead kind of freight train as a product of the sum of its parts and not about any one individual. And perhaps most importantly, um, as a place where the audience has this direct relationship with what's happening on stage. And even as the Grateful Dead grew and to become a stadium band, that remained. The audience was a huge part of kind of what was being created on stage. The band would feed off the audience would feed off the band, and something special could happen. It didn't always happen, But when it did, the heavens opened up and it was truly, truly extraordinary. And that really came from the acid test. So that's kind of part one of what created the foundation of the Grateful Dead's association, and kind of acceptable relationship for having psychedelics be such a huge part of the fold. Number two, um, Owsley. We cannot underestimate the importance of Owsley Stanley, right? Um, Owsley, also known as the Bear, um, had a dual relationship with the scene. Um, from oops, from 1965 to 67, he was a chemist to produce millions of doses of LSD. But and the Orange Sunshine brand came from Owsley's lab, and the formula kind of disseminated out to where other people were making it too. But Owsley was, one of the primary manufacturers of LSD in the 1960s, and chemists, and responsible for turning on countless millions of people. But Owsley also had another kind of trick up his sleeve. He just wasn't a chemist. He was a sound guy and an audio engineer, and a damn good one too. A really, really, really good one. His relationship with sound and his knowledge of equipment really helped make the Grateful Dead into the live touring ecosystem that they became. From a basic music perspective, what everybody has to understand is that from, say, 65 till about 71, live music in large auditoriums didn't really work well in large venues. This is a huge reason why the Beatles stopped touring. In 65 and 66, the PAs were terrible. There were no monitors. They couldn't hear themselves. And the concert at Shea Stadium, really famous. If you weren't in the immediate vicinity in the back rows, you couldn't hear it. So playing to large venues was very impractical, and nobody could really figure out how to do it. And Owsley played a huge role in working with a company called Meyer Sound in San Francisco to help develop live, PAs that sounded good in large venues. So the instruments could really be heard. And he was an essential part of the Grateful Dead's audio engineering, and also refining the equipment as well. Owsley did he took a little break from this relationship with the Grateful Dead because he went to prison from 70 to 72. But when he got out, he created the Wall of Sound, which was highly impractical. They couldn't keep it going for more than a year. Um, but nonetheless, Owsley's understanding of really how to bring the sonic perfection to large numbers of people is massive. We can't thank Owsley enough. And also too, what's isn't talked about enough is the way the Grateful Dead, thanks to Owsley and Dan Healy as well. There were others in the mix as well. It wasn't just Owsley, but also paved the way for lots of other bands, to perfect their sound live too. Really interesting stuff. But, the reason I'm bringing up Owsley is because, Owsley is, he was a chemist. He made millions of hits of LSD and provided the LSD for the acid tests, and continued to make small batches of LSD for the friends and family, and even after his bust in the early 70s. And that relationship with kind of a directness to the creation of LSD never stopped. Owsley was always part of the Grateful Dead's fabric. After the Wall of Sound, he wasn't. really going on the road with them as much to make shows, but he was still part of the family, you know. On the left there is the Bear's Choice album, which is some of his favorite tracks that he mixed and recorded and released as a live album. So, you know, it- again, the point is that, you know, Owsley's contribution, which was rooted in psychedelics and psychedelic exploration and the acid tests and sonic tapestry to make for a psychedelic soundtrack, really helped the Grateful Dead grow, you know, into a proper touring act and not no longer playing small little venues like the Fillmore East and West and really growing and growing. So again, psychedelics, just like the acid tests, you know, was in their DNA, you know. And Owsley thought it was so important that, you know, he saw it was around 1971 when the Skull and Roses album came out that the term deadhead was coined, and they started noticing that, oh, a lot of the same people are coming to shows over and over again, you know, and they started to notice that, and that was really important to them to you know cater to them and to bring something you know of value to them every night, and that included the sonic experience because they know, hey, if these people are going to follow us around and travel around the country and come to multiple shows and spend their money and take acid, we want to give them a good sonic experience. So I think, you know, that's a really important part of this is that, you know, the Grateful Dead sounded good. You know, it sonically sounded good all the way up until the end, you know, and that made for a very conducive environment for young, impressionable uh, teenage deadheads like myself to dose, and older heads as well, you know, to revisit it. But really, really, really important. Um, yeah, let's spend just a little time listening to music. So um we heard 60 seconds from the acid tests, right? And it sounded pretty raw, you know, not very good. Um, one of the first songs, if not the first song, where the Grateful Dead started jamming it out and started finding this formula for improvisational kind of spontaneity was the song Viola Lee Blues. That was the one. They started playing it really early, you know, in their career. And it was the one to where, like, I guess the story goes, after the third verse, as they started kind of jamming it, Jerry started soloing. They didn't really know how to end it, so they just kept playing. And that was like, oh, okay, if we keep playing, maybe this will grow into something else. And around at the same time, other influences started affecting the Grateful Dead's music. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, McCoy Tyner, this kind of jazz foundation for bringing in modal improvisation into rock and roll. So really, really, really important. We're obviously not going to listen to, sorry, I got to share the sound. We're not going to listen to um, all of Viola Lee Blues because it's 14 minutes long, but this is from 67, by the way, at the Fillmore West.
Some got 6 months, some got one solid, some got one solid, yeah, indeed. Some got 6 months, some got one solid, yeah.
So,
But me and my buddy walk a lifetime hell.
kind of a standard R&B song, you know, but you can hear. So you can really hear the psychedelic influence, right? It's all there. It's plain as day. And you can see how the sound was starting to formulate. And they were taking kind of that inspiration, that kind of raw asymmetrical stuff from the acid tests and formulating it into something that sounded like, hey, this is almost professional sounding. And this is 67, mind you, right? This is still, pretty early on in the game. Um, then in 1968 is really when things started to change.
The other day they waited. The sky was dark and faded. Silently they stated he has to die. You know he has to die. And all the children and
The intro to That's It for the Other One.
down on him.
Into the other one. For you deadheads, you guys all know the other one. But then this album, as they jam it out, goes into this very psychedelic. So on and so forth. But, that's it for the other one on Anthem of the Sun. Anthem of the Sun is a psychedelic masterpiece, a lot of people say Working Man's Dead and American Beauty are kind of their two finest albums. But Anthem of the Sun, man, that is the one that really was the psychedelic, the shot fired. And it's just a psychedelic masterpiece. It creates such this amazing tapestry for the psychedelic influence that allowed so many people to tap in and to turn on. Incredible, incredible stuff. Next, we're gonna have fun with this. Um, Dark Star from 21470, which is one of my favorite Dark Stars. So it's 30 minutes of Dark Star. We can't get into all of it, but as much as I'd love to. gets really quiet. So, as I was saying, what is really interesting here from a chronological perspective is going from the acid tests, right? You know, pretty cool, but not very good. 1967, hey, things are starting to take shape here. It's not the Jerry that we know and love, but it's starting to become kind of this force of something really special and different that was providing, the soundtrack for countless numbers of people to turn on to. Then by 68, 69, really starting to take shape. Then by 70, at this Fillmore East show, I mean, Jerry was in full force. You can tell the evolution of his instrument from playing in the acid tests in 66, the first video, just, 4 years later is night and day. He's like literally become a master of his craft on the guitar, and Bobby too, and Phil, all of them, just incredible musicians, and Dark Star had to play Dark Star because Dark Star really became the foundational kind of method enterprise song that created the improvisational kind of place where anything could happen, and it is said that, Dark Star turned more people on than maybe even Owsley did. Dark Star is the one that really, changed everything for people. Um, and yeah, and the Grateful Dead, brought Dark Star, they retired it for a while, brought it back, retired it, and brought it back. Fortunately, in my era, the late 80s and 90s, they brought it back, which was really, really happy about that. But Dark Star was the one, was the one that really created that atmosphere, and certainly I think is the again the sonic foundation for so many people's psychedelic experience, right? Next, we're not going to go through the entire chronology of the Grateful Dead because we would be here all night, but we're going to go to 1974 to the playing in the band from Seattle, 5/21/74. This is the Grateful Dead's longest playing in the band, clocking in at 46 minutes. But, if you kind of listen to the jam, you can see, that DNA of letting the music kind of fuel adventure was still there. It never went away, right? So let's check into this playing in the band for a little bit.
Some folks look for answers, others look for flies, and some folks up in treetops just looking for their kites. But I can tell your future, but look what's in your hand. But I can't stop for nothing, I'm just playing in the band.
They
Playing.
got the verses. About 2 minutes into the jam. minutes into the jam, it slows down, picks back up again, gets completely jazzy and atonal. Gets quiet, and they keep it going. Completely jazzy, almost swinging. I mean, that could be the Mahavishnu Orchestra, you know, complete jazz. And on, and that goes on for, 45 plus minutes, But, you know, for all of us who are psychonauts and take psychedelics, right? What is sort of like the one constant, right? Is that you just have to go with it. You just have to surrender to what's happening, right? And even if you set the most rigorous intentions in your psychedelic experience, you're still going to get surprised. The medicine's still going to take you around some corners and through the woods and through the stars and back in and bring up stuff that maybe you never really planned for, right? What do we tell all people, right? For us facilitators out there, right? Surrender, let go, receive, observe, breathe into it. And to have music that is completely symbolic of that, that represents kind of our instructions for using psychedelics. What other band was doing that? No one really, right? I mean, that playing in the band is 45 minutes of, the most encapsulated psychedelic experience that you could possibly imagine. It goes through a structured song that has order and verses, and then it gets into chaos, it gets into jazz, it gets atonal, finds harmony again. It is by definition psychedelic, right? Absolutely incredible. I'm a big fan of 73 and 74. Only one drummer, but man, there's not a bad show in the bunch. Next, I'm not going to, like I said, take us through the whole chronology, but, as we got into later years, there were still plenty of good jams, playing in the band when they brought Dark Star back. Those songs had plenty of psychedelic moments, Birdsong, Cassidy, of course, lots of great, jamming improvisational numbers. Um, but the shows definitely got tighter and more song oriented, less risky, still great, and a lot of great jams, like I said. But what they started doing in every show from, basically late 70s, early 80s on is adding this drums and space section to each show, which was essentially just a sonic freakout time of the show that had no order or structure or harmony to it. And they just did it to kind of keep a little bit of that DNA alive and well. Um, so this is from Infrared Roses. So that's a space from 1989, and I highly recommend too. People forget about it, don't talk about it nearly as much, but the Infrared Roses album is really cool, and it's good journey music too, by the way. Challenging, it's not exactly warm and fuzzy, but it's pretty challenging and a lot of fun to be with. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to share those five sonic examples of how psychedelics became kind of, a foundational part of what the Grateful Dead continue to do, even though the band wasn't tripping in, you know, the same way that, they were in the acid tests or even, in the late 60s. It was still in them. Um, and it was still a huge part of the music. So, you know, um, one concept that I've been thinking a lot about is, the setting, the Grateful Dead setting was so potent and formidable that it informs the set, right? Of course, we have the parking lot, this traveling circus that of people that went with them to every shows, myself included, perhaps many of you as well. This tribal pulse people who were really on a hero's journey, like Campbell wrote about the Grateful Dead experience. It really was kind of a hero's journey in and of itself. And the show itself with Candace Brightman's lighting certainly made for a great experience. But it is really interesting how, you know, the Grateful Dead, like we usually refer, right, to music and the place where we do the medicine as the setting, right? As part of the setting. But I think the Grateful Dead's setting was so potent that it could affect the set. Going into it, like I remember, especially I was kind of finding some maturity of my own, that um, because I knew what the tapestry of the set was, it was, well, the characteristics of it, that it would really help me to set my own mood ahead of time. It would help prepare me for what was going to come. It would kind of change my emotional direction ahead of time. Um, which is a really fascinating thing. I think today maybe something that is slightly equivalent might be Burning Man, perhaps. Burning Man is a pretty powerful container that can take you down quite a few rabbit holes. Um, but what Dead shows became, it really became this thing that you looked forward to and you planned for ahead of time to really set the stage for your own explorations. So I think that is something I would give the Grateful Dead that no other institution, I guess, really accomplished in the same way in the psychedelic space. Um, with it also, came, you got the music and the lights and the community, but you also got this safe space of being around kind of this living organism rooted in empathy, of people who understood what it is that you were looking for in this whole thing, right? Um, so yeah, I can't thank them enough, even into later days, way post Jerry, even in recent years, I think while things changed considerably, especially around sort of the corporatization of it, it still was a place to, take risks at, to use psychedelics in a way to really, chase the magic and to kind of you know, mine for gold, mine for truth, mine for whatever it is that you were looking for. So I think that's a really, really interesting phenomenon of around the whole thing. Um, finally, around some kind of pragmatic and just practical stuff, right? Um, I call this slide Shakedown Street, literally. Um, It was estimated that from 80 to 87, the Grateful Dead scene accounted for about 40% of the country's LSD supply, meaning the scene, anytime they went on tour, about 40% of the country's acid would pass through there and either get bought or sold or consumed, right? After the Touch of Grey explosion, and they found new popularity in '87, moving on, and started playing bigger venues and started playing stadiums again, and found a whole new birth of popularity for people like me. I'm part of that era. Um, it was estimated that the Grateful Dead's scene accounted for about 80% of the country's LSD market. I mean, that is an incredibly huge number. And if you, there are some interesting analyses out there if you want to bring them up. But after the Grateful Dead, after Jerry died and the Grateful Dead ceased to exist, there was a tremendous dry spell for LSD in America. It kind of dried up for a few years. Um, Fish took it over, and a huge part of that found its way back into the fish scene. I don't think the fish guys were too thrilled with that as much as the Grateful Dead guys were, but it did as fish grew, and Burning Man as it grew as well. LSD kind of found a place for it to, hey, look, it's an illegal compound, but yet millions of people do it, and you got to buy it somewhere. It's just the reality of it. But yeah, I think around 88, 89, at the peak of their newfound popularity, about 80% of the LSD market existed in the Grateful Dead parking lot. I mean, that's just wild, right? And what can we say? We don't know the number, but millions and millions of people turned on for the first time and maybe even for their most memorable time at a Grateful Dead concert. Millions of people have a psychedelic experience associated with a Dead show. Some of them, their most memorable experience, psychedelic experiences of their life. A lot of people, their first psychedelic experience. So that is an incredible thing, right? That is really, really, really memorable. Um, so yeah, to kind of bring it all back, the question that I asked at the beginning is, why was the Grateful Dead such a foundational place for the psychedelic experience to occur? What is it about their ecosystem made it be so conducive for, I'd say, the vast majority were successful psychedelic experiences. Like I said, I'm happy to, you know, be held accountable. I did see some people freak out and have some bad trips. But for the most part, I think it was overall a really, really positive experience and showed that, you know, so-called what we now refer to, it's almost become a derogatory term as recreational use, that it can be done successfully. It can be done impactfully, expansively, in a way that can really change your life forever. And I can certainly speak to that. My psychedelic experiences at dead shows in my early life, they're part of who I am. I would be a very, very different person if it weren't for them. There's no question about that. I would be a very, very different human being if it weren't for that. Um, and for that, I'm incredibly grateful. As I said in the beginning, a huge part of what inspired me to want to do this was the death of Bob Weir and Bobby, and there's an incredible sadness there, of course. But it will live on in my hearts and so many of our hearts, and I'm so glad that I was there. You know, um, that spirit and intentionality for using psychedelics in that way is something that, I still have positive admiration for, and I can't completely condemn it. We know a lot more today about the safe use of psychedelics, especially around mental health issues, right? About who should be doing psychedelics and who shouldn't be. I think more especially the who shouldn't be. We know more about that today than we did then. And I think that's a huge part of what went wrong in the 60s with psychedelics is, and even in the dead scene later on, a lot of people were using acid who had no business using it in the first place. We didn't really know about, underlying mental health conditions and how to go through, you know, a really intentional and deliberate and honest kind of screening process for yourself. Um, and for that, some people definitely paid the price and became acid casualties, but a lot of people didn't too. Um, and our world is a better place for it. I think, no doubt. I think the world is a better place for what the Grateful Dead brought to psychedelic exploration, what it brought to music. Um, and yeah, what it brought to the community as well, around the music itself. I'm glad I got to share a few audio examples with you guys because that is really important to me. I could spend hours doing this and playing, selecting just music and analyzing it and really getting into it. But, um, you know, again, just to kind of close the loop on that, if you're ever kind of wondering how psychedelics influenced modern music, just listen to, the tracks that I played, you know. Those are, you know, amazing testimonials for what psychedelics can do to creativity, what they can do to cooperation too, with playing with other people and listening and understanding music and seeing music behave in a different way rather than just kind of this standard, very tight black and white execution of how to play music. It was fluid, it was alive, it was a living organism. So not only did, the Grateful Dead provide this amazing setting and soundtrack for us, but they also showed us, you know, the tremendous potential that LSD can have on creativity, and extraordinary, right? So I think that's about all I have. But if anybody would like to chime in and share any stories they have from the Grateful Dead scene or ask any questions or share anything, if more than one of you go, maybe just use the hand raising feature. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
Brian.
So just, Zach, I don't know if you knew Carolyn Garcia.
Uh,
No?
Mountain Girl?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I know Mountain Girl a little bit. Yeah,
Yeah, she
yeah,
presented at in Denver for Psychedelic Science in 23.
yeah.
Were you there?
I was. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was just what a wonderful presentation and sharing her history. She was just really so humble and kind of gentle. But towards the end, I thought it was really funny when somebody in the audience asked her, like, what was it like to trip with Jerry Garcia? And I don't know if you remember her answer, but she said they actually never tripped together. That the way, if I recall it properly, maybe you remember this or part of it. The way I recall is she said that they didn't really use large doses like people may think they did, but
Mm.
they would do kind of museum doses when they would
Yeah,
play because it enhanced their creativity.
yeah,
And yeah, and that's really interesting how that may play into the evolution and just how the music morphed and the jam sessions and yeah, it's pretty incredible. So I didn't know if you remember part of that or more of it.
yeah. I do know that they found out very early that big doses were just non-conducive. As I said at the acid test, there were nights when they showed up and they couldn't play. They literally couldn't, and they knew right away. Oh, okay, there's a sweet spot here, you know. And yeah, more museum doses. But yeah, I didn't remember that bit that they never tripped together. That's interesting. I don't remember that. Huh. Really interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing that though. But Mountain Girl's lovely and I like her. She's always very kind to me when I see her and I appreciate her a lot. Yeah.
Nice.
Whoever is owner, whoever's Zoom handle is owner, I don't know who that is. You have your hand up. Yeah, you got to unmute. Oh yeah, I don't see your microphone working though. No, can't hear. Yeah, go to the little audio arrow, the little arrow by your microphone on Zoom and select the right mic if you can't find it. No. Well, I'll come back to you. Fiddle with your settings and we'll come back to you. Patricia.
Thank you for sharing tonight. Just a little share. I was at the last Grateful Dead concert in Chicago
Oh,
where Sting opened, and you might know Ken Nordine. I knew the Nordines, and I had like sound booth tickets, and it was pretty beautiful. Uh,
mm,
but I'm just curious about. I have a question about music's really important to me. It was always important when I was a kid and I was doing psychedelics very recreationally, and now I
mm,
facilitate a lot of people or sit for people. And I'm just curious what you think the effect is, of psychedelics on people now who are listening to the more electronic
mm.
music, like for generations that didn't listen to Grateful Dead and
Yeah, one of my favorite psychedelic soundtracks is Aphex Twin, which is, a classic electronic music artist. So I get it. I really do get it. I understand it, and, we also, the British rave scene of the 80s was a huge reason of the influx of popularity of MDMA. That's really what fueled it was how MDMA leaked from the lab and made its way to Britain and the early post-industrial electronica thing, those raves in Bristol in the mid 80s, created that whole kind of symbiosis. So you know, um, yeah, I remember I remember I got into electronic music early. I immediately took to it. I thought it was really cool. And I remember a lot of my Deadhead friends were like, "Ugh, what is that, man? That's not real music. Those are machines." But they all came around in the end, because I think, good live electronic music has some of the similar characteristics of like a togetherness when you're on the dance floor, pulsating together, and the spontaneity of DJs and electronic. They can take it and twist it into new different worlds, and make it different every night. So I think there's an incredible similarity there, although it doesn't sound the same on the surface. I think the spirit is very similar. So I have an incredible love for electronic music, and I do have to say though, I'll qualify that by um, I find certain compounds with electronic music, like after a while, I'm like, whoa, shit, that's enough. Like I'm like, oh my God, I need a break. MDMA is a little different, but like LSD or something after like a couple hours, I'm like, whoa, I need a break, But that's me, because it's so relentless and pulsating. But yeah, but I'm a big fan of the electronica scene, and I think there's a lot of good that can come from it. Yeah, I do so though, with sort of mainstream electronica like Electric Daisy Carnival and stuff, we see quite a bit of misuse. Like Electric Daisy Carnival for specifically, there is always a good, 100 to 150 psychedelic overdoses every year at that festival. A lot of that due to impure compounds, but companies like Dance Safe are making good testing kits now, but still, that's one cautionary tale is just being careful about that. Yeah. But yeah, thanks, Patricia. Good to see you. Owner, did you get your microphone fixed? No, can't hear you. Oh man. Sorry, man. Um, Anyone else have want to share their experiences, questions?
Or for the guy with the name owner, can he just type his question out?
Yeah, there's an idea. Go ahead, use the chat box, man, if you want to type your thoughts out if it's short-ish form, welcome to do that. Mm. While that is happening, anyone else? Yeah. Um, uh, we'll see if he's typing away here. Um, yeah. So, oh, hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know about different tribes. That's interesting, but I think um yeah, I mean, I remember the parking lot scene so well, shrooms, doses, doses. I think it was kind of more dependent on how long of a journey you wanted to go on. LSD is so long, for better or for worse. It is awfully long. And the thing about LSD at dead shows, which I always really remembered, is that it extends much longer than the show. So you needed to be prepared for what to do afterwards because you were not done yet. The show would go on for a really long time, or the dose would go on for a really long time, long after the show is over. Um, so mushrooms are definitely good. You could time it perhaps a little bit better, for sure. But yeah, interesting question. Yeah. But yeah, that too. Acid purity is a legitimate thing. There was some bad acid there, no question. Where shrooms is a little bit more predictable. But all right, guys. Yeah, I really appreciate you all coming. What about Donna? Yeah, well, what about Donna? Right? There's a lot to say about Donna. Um, yeah, no, you're right, Donna. We did lose Donna this year as well. And no question, she was, a huge part of the music, for those years, no doubt. And I wish I got to see them back then because kind of seeing a little female presence on stage would have felt a lot different. But yeah, Donna too. Um, yeah, we had um 95 RSVPs for this thing, so a lot of people did not come, but I appreciate you guys for coming very, very much.